I have a story that came out today in the brand new Sublation magazine, which y'all should definitely be checking out. They're going to be publishing a lot of really great pieces in the near future. It's run by a lot of different folks, but folks you would know, our friend Gene Bajelon, and also Doug Lane, who has also launched Sublation Books as well. But Gene asked me to write this piece, and I figured it's worth going over again on this program because it's an interesting story. One, just because of the political consequences and what Abbott's doing here in Texas. But two, because it really shows I don't know, it's a kind of a counter narrative, I think, to some people sort of on the left who I think understandably have, worries and criticisms of state power and state overreach. And we saw a lot of that in the early COVID days. I mean, quite devastatingly, for example, in New York, where you had Cuomo exerting a lot of personal power and also hiding, mass deaths in, nursing homes and things of that nature. But a lot of times when people talk about COVID, they're focusing when they're talking about making these criticisms, they're sort of focusing on the level of policy, right? Do you support mandates or do you not support mandates? Do you support lockdowns or do you not support lockdowns? And I think at least in Texas that conversation really misses the point. You have a lot of kind of right-wing folks who moved to Texas in the past 2 years, specifically because they like that Abbott had a kind of live and let live philosophy towards COVID. But that philosophy is extremely limited when it comes to the amount of power that Abbott wants to pull to himself. So this has been happening every month since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Greg Abbott will extend a disaster declaration over the COVID-19 pandemic. And, I know it's different everywhere else, but here in Texas, I mean, you very rarely have seen a mask anywhere. Really the only kind of relics of that system are just sort of old paper, posters on the outside of businesses sort of outlining COVID protocols that are frankly non-existent at this point. But Abbott, despite the fact that he's been very much anti-mandate, he's been waging war on local authorities, city authorities, county authorities, school systems over any kind of very basic COVID protocols. While he's been waging those wars, sort of saying that like the time of the mandates are over, he hasn't wanted to relinquish the emergency powers that came with the early pandemic and has been using them quite successfully. Most notably, he has extended the COVID-19 disaster declaration to the border and to immigration. This has been over the fight over Title 42, which was a Trump-era policy that basically denied people their basic human rights, their basic asylum rights to enter the country as political, people seeking asylum. Trump blocked that. And the Biden administration has signaled that that they're thinking about pulling that back in the near future. Abbott declared a COVID-19 disaster declaration for the border counties, include actually 34 counties. So some of those counties aren't even directly on the border, citing that he's worried that immigrants are going to bring COVID-19 into Texas. Just very ironic for somebody who is, not very worried about it being spread by anybody else except for, immigrants from the Americas. He has used this, the powers that he's used, because if people aren't familiar with Texas politics, and I think even a lot of Texans aren't familiar with this because we've been living through a couple decades that have really shifted the office of the governor. The governor's office in Texas is what's called a weak governor system. The people who created the Constitution in 1876 were very worried, rightfully or wrongfully, about a very strong executive, and they wanted to limit the executive power as much as possible. For a long time, governors in Texas were only elected for extremely short terms. But most importantly, the powers of the governor were extremely limited. One, because they weren't able to set up a cabinet, and that's pretty much how most governors are able to exert their executive authority in other states in the country, because they're able to basically put somebody in, whatever their equivalent of a labor department is, or health department, or something like that. In Texas, most of those boards are they're either elected directly or they are appointed on a staggered basis, so that no one governor would basically be able to control the entirety of those boards. That started to change when the Democratic Party completely imploded in this state, because now after years and years and years of GOP rule, most of those people who are appointed to those boards, and even many of the people who are elected to them, are loyal to the Republican Party. Rick Perry, the former governor, really changed this into a kind of clientelist system, where basically everybody who was on these state boards was extremely loyal to him. They were going to do what he said, and Abbott inherited that and has only deepened, just like the amount of power and influence he has over these people. A lot of this comes is about money. Abbott is an incredible fundraiser. We'll give him that. He loves to schmooze and talk on the phone to boys. The rich boys at least, and he rewards them with positions, in his government. But if that were just the story, it'd be interesting. It'd be notable for people in Texas. But it is this extension of power that he has gotten with this disaster declaration. The disaster declaration in Texas was set up in the 70s. So that a governor in a situation like a hurricane or a massive flood would just be able to move resources quickly to be able to make sure that Texas' needs were being taken care of. And it's a very, very broad disaster power. It really allows them to override all the kind of checks and distribution of power in the state and centralize power in the governor. Again, as I said, something that was completely, was something that the people who wrote the Constitution of Texas did never want to see happen. And Abbott has now continued to extend this disaster declaration to such an extent that now Florida and New York, they had much shorter disaster declarations. This is the longest disaster declaration in Texas's history. And, people remember probably a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about what he did at the border, where he basically set up a second system of checkpoints that let food rot on trucks, slow down production and distribution of goods that are coming not just into Texas, but the entire country, and cost, upwards of, a couple $1 billion in lost revenue and trade because of this really insane move that he was doing. And remember, I mean, like, not that we would want it to be efficient or a good inspection, but it was so symbolic. They weren't actually able to even investigate what was inside of truck cargo. They were only able to do basically truck safety checks. And yeah, there were a few trucks that were found unsafe to drive. Their headlights didn't work or their brake pads were a little worn. And, maybe that was good preventing an accident or something like that. But he said he was trying to stop fentanyl and human trafficking. And I'll tell you all this right now, that if they found anything, you would know about it by now.
They're smuggling fentanyl in the brake pads. And they found some. Yeah.
And I'm trying to because I want to talk about the National Guard in a second. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. People should read the piece. I break down a lot of this history and how he's used his power and the kind of legality around it. Sorry, Matt.
I was just gonna say, go read and share David's piece.
Oh, I appreciate that. But I wanted to focus specifically on this National Guard story and Operation Lone Star, because this is a very, very worrying story here. So for people who aren't familiar, it goes along with what I was just talking about with the kind of second checkpoint that they set up at the border. But Abbott has deployed thousands of Texas National Guard members to the border to basically run a parallel operation to the federal government. And if you're already worried about what Abbott is doing inside the state of Texas, you should also be worried about a state governor, going and trying to negotiate treaties with Mexican governors. That is not a power that state governors have to basically be able to operate as if they're their own independent country. And all that you can see from what Abbott has learned in this period of time, these past 2 years, is that he can get away with this. And the GOP is unwilling to stand up and to challenge him on this. When the Democrats were trying to run their protest against SB 8 here, which was the anti-abortion bill, a bunch of Democrats fled the state of Texas to basically prevent there from being quorum so that they couldn't actually pass the bill. And Abbott waged war on the legislature, not just Democrats, but Republicans as well, and pulled back funding for all staffers who work in the Texas legislature. And you got a little bit of kicking, a little bit of complaining, but the GOP completely acquiesced to Abbott, really, really running this state like a tyrant. And ignoring the separation of powers, and most importantly, ignoring the intention of the system, which was to have the most power sort of held in the legislature. He's used his veto power at an extreme rate. And he's using these executive orders, which again has never really been a big part of how you run the state of Texas. For the most part, even in Abbott's early administration, most of these executive orders or orders from the governor are things like, oh, let's put some funding to help a group of people who are suffering after a hurricane, or to say, oh, we want to have a celebration for former President George Bush, to honor him as a great Texas man, right? Like symbolic stuff, and then just kind of very, very general, unoffensive reshuffling for the most part of funds. But going back to Operation Lone Star, because this is a huge scandal here, man. They have held about, I think it's about 6,500 people they've deployed about 6,500 people to the border. Abbott is also adamant about building a border wall. He's using this executive authority that he has taken to override and basically just ignore the legislature to reapportion more and more and more money to the border in this failed operation, to the tune of something like $4 billion. Some of that came from the legislature, but a lot of that came from Abbott basically reshuffling money using these executive powers that he's taken for himself. But if it was just about a waste of money, it also has to be noted too that this whole thing, if you think about $4 billion with very little oversight, has just been a cash cow for private contractors with little to no oversight. If it was just about the way that they're spending money, it'd be a scandal. But it gets much, much, much worse because the people who are being called up to the border, these Texas National Guardsmen, are working under absolutely brutal conditions. You have to remember that there's a big difference between being called up for a federal mission if you're in the National Guard versus a state mission. Most importantly, pay is less. You don't have access to the federal healthcare system, and if you're killed in action, you get workers' comp. Your family gets workers' comp after you pass, and you have to go through all of these kind of bureaucratic bureaucratic processes to even get it. And a lot of those people end up failing to collect their paperwork and turn their paperwork in a way that's accessible to the state, and they either don't get it paid out or it gets delayed significantly. Versus if you're killed in action on a federal mission, your family gets $100,000 immediately. That's it, done. And this matters because just earlier in April, a Texas National Guardsman drowned. Bishop Evans drowned while jumping into the Rio Grande to save a migrant family who was trying to cross the river. The most basic human thing. You're seeing somebody suffer and you want to help out them. You want to help them out. And he's not alone. Warning, I'll talk about suicides in a second. But there has been a real uptick of National Guardsmen who have been committing suicide, because you have to remember that these are people who have civilian jobs on the top of this. You pull them away for months on end on a mission that most of them recognize is useless and is symbolic, and they're being used as political tools by the governor. They're losing their jobs, they're losing their income, and they're worried about what's going to happen to their family and their life when they come back from the service. It's very, very bleak, and we'll look at some of the examples in just one second. But I also wanted to note, they're giving this mission has been a huge boon to private contractors, has been a huge waste of taxpayer money in the state of Texas, and it doesn't seem like it's being run on any kind of, like, drop the politics, drop the morality, anything like this, just basic how you run an operation of this scale. It is a mess. When Bishop Evans drowned, there was a big investigation as to how this could happen. And the leaders of the operation were asked, is there a protocol for guardsmen when it comes to entering the water in this kind of situation? They said no. Are guardsmen given flotation devices, right, which you think would be a very, very basic, kind of protocol? No. When we're talking about the Texas border, we're talking about a river. We're talking about a big river, and there's no protocol about whether or not you should be coming into the water, getting safety equipment for people. I mean, it's a huge scandal. And now, instead of doing those kind of basic things, National Guardsmen have been told that if they see somebody drowning, to watch them drown and to not come and save them. Absolutely inhuman and disgusting, kind of leadership there. But let's talk about this, because there's an exciting development on this piece too. when it does come to the National Guard. Let me just read it just to paint the picture a little bit more. This is from my piece. This is an interview that was done by Army Times with different National Guards members. I'm wasting time watching the grass grow at my observation point along the border while my civilian job is dying on the vine. If we could pull up this Army Times piece, Matt, there's a few other things that are worth noting. In this kind of, Army Times went and they interviewed a bunch of guardsmen. As many as 1 in 5 troops in the 6,500 strong operational force who have been sent to the border have reported problems with their pay, which also, remember, is less than they would be getting if they were getting a federal mission. 2, including being paid late, too little, or not at all for months. I mean, imagine that. You have a family to take care of and you're just getting no income. You're losing
Right.
your
Well,
civilian job.
it needs to be stressed. Like, that's why they've joined this thing in the fucking first place. This isn't, I mean, out of the
Yeah.
most part, patriotism, like serving their country, which is what the right will want to present this as, right? This is about people not having enough to like support a family, joining up to become a National Guards person, and then being used as a political pawn like this. Like, and this comes up like when we talk about benefits and stuff. Like, well, how are we going if we just extend healthcare and pay to all these people? How are we going to get recruits to the military and to National Guard? It's like, that's why, is they like that. And so like the double impact you're saying is like, I can't imagine being in that fucking position that like, this is not what you signed up for, where it's actually putting you behind and they're not even fucking paying you.
Totally. And the conditions are horrible. Noted here, many are living in cramped trailers with dozens of troops. I mean, imagine being on assignment like that. And then also like having the realization too that there's no reason for you to be there in the first place. Again, even by the standards that the right wants, this has not been a successful operation when it comes to stopping drug trafficking, things of that nature. Some say they feel underutilized and rarely even see migrants while working in isolated observation posts that in some cases lack portable toilets for months. Service members have struggled with shortages of critical equipment, including cold weather gear, medical equipment, and plates for their ballistic vests. If you want to pull up this next story here, because they're not just accepting it, and this is actually, it's a pretty interesting precedent here, and we'll be following this as it continues to develop. But this is in Jacobin. It's been reported elsewhere as well. Texas soldiers are unionizing after facing attacks by a right-wing governor. The people in the National Guard who are, again, facing these horrific conditions, just abused by the governor, abused by the system, are being underpaid. And also remember that oftentimes these guys are doing missions because Biden has also mobilized. There is a federal mission, too, that's mobilized National Guard troops to the border as well. So oftentimes they're working next to somebody who has the benefits and the pay and the protections that they're not getting because they were called up by Greg Abbott. But these soldiers are now actively unionizing. Now, for people who aren't familiar, in the United States, because in the Vietnam War, there was a lot of organizing amongst soldiers to actually create a kind of proto-union force that was going to be able to push back against the abuse that they were facing and push back against the barbaric war in Vietnam. The United States government effectively outlawed any kind of labor organization or made it illegal to be a member of a labor organization if you're in the military. But earlier this year, the Justice Department released a document saying that National Guardsmen who are pulled up by their governor on a state mission are allowed to join the state employees union. So this is a very, very new thing. This is not something that's been around for a while, and people are taking advantage of this moment here in Texas and are trying to organize National Guardsmen, the 6,500 member force here, into a union so that they can get the kind of basic protections that they need, so that they can get helped out. They have an uphill fight because remember, if you're on deployment, they control every aspect of your life. Think about the shit that they're doing to people at Starbucks. Imagine if you lived there, right? It's an uphill fight, but it's a very encouraging one, I must say.
I was shocked to even find that this was allowable, that even for domestic stuff. But I think what it's amazing is like, and the optimistic takeaway is that this shows a rising consciousness for the power of collective bargaining and forming unions, because like we're seeing it everywhere now, right? You see it at Amazon, Starbucks. Starbucks replacing like traditionally wasn't thought of as as this hospitable ground, and now National Guards folks. And that's not because that's not because of the squad. It's not because of media. It's
Hmm.
because of the conditions. And it's heartening to see so many people like go down this route. And I think it's just like our responsibility to keep this going as best we can.
Totally, and I think it's very exciting, and I think it would also be good, politically too, to have the soldiers themselves challenging Abbott on all of this. Uh, Maybe just to end, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Matt. I mean, the reason I've been interested in this story as it's sort of been developing, and I've been interested in it, I've sort of following this for a while now. Um, is that I think that a lot of, as I said at the top, like a lot of the criticisms of kind of COVID era um, policy from the government, um, who were saying, "Oh, the government's overstepping its reach. They're sort of asserting powers for themselves." We're so hyper focused on the policies themselves, right? And I think oftentimes more reflected how you felt about, wearing a mask or not. Um, then the actual question of whether or not this is good for democracy. Because here in Texas, they don't have the mandates, but we have seen an unprecedented centralization of power that is quite dangerous. It's having consequences, and it doesn't seem like there is any motivation on Abbott's part to limit this. And as long as the GOP is in control of the legislature, there is very little check on this. It's very much under the radar kind of stuff, which is how Abbott operates. Um, it's worth noting, just if people aren't familiar with this, Greg Abbott is in a wheelchair because when he was younger, he was hit by a tree that fell when he was out for a jog. And Abbott sued the tree company that worked on the tree and the homeowner. And I think got somewhere near, I have it in here, $11 million or something like that. Um, $11 million at the end of his at the end of his settlement, which I think is going to be paid out. Yeah, $11 million, which will be paid out at the end of this year in full. And then when he got onto the Supreme Court, and then when he was an attorney general, Abbott campaigned ferociously to limit non-medical expenses from any kind of personal injury lawsuit, where it is now capped at just $250,000. So this is somebody who benefited from a system that allowed him to collect millions of dollars, and is now blocking other people today from being able to sue and get those kind of damages for themselves. Right? He's somebody who like very much floats whichever way the wind goes. When Bush was in power, he was a Bush-style Republican. Trump's in power, he's now a Trumpy guy. Um, he's devastating the state with his just love affair with these kind of this super privatized grid. They have done very, very little to weatherize and protect Texans from the failure that ended up killing 700 people. And he sees a golden opportunity here. I'll give him this, right? He's got a very sharp legal mind, and he understands how to play this game well. That's how he rose to power in Texas politics, because he was somebody who could get things done. What motivates him is a bit of a question. I would argue that it's money. This is somebody who always follows the campaign contributions. And in a system like Texas's, in a system that Abbott runs, he rewards these guys in a big way. He got $4.6 million in donations after the winter storm happened from the very companies who he should have been, coming at and regulating and forcing to weatherize the grid. And the point here is about, the COVID-19 powers that governors and mayors and, even the federal government enjoyed. I think that it's 100% an accurate question to say there needs to be challenges and abilities to call back these emergency powers, because we're seeing here, there is no real horizon to Abbott's emergency powers. And I think he's going to continue to use this as long as it's viable for him, which could be a very, very long time.
Right, certainly longer than Democrats are willing to use emergency powers for anything like getting people to stay at home or something like that. Which is, you see how this stuff sticks is to put the screws to workers. Generally, yeah. My general take is just a frustration with what's the imperative of the ruling class during the COVID era? It's to get people's ass back to work. Right, That's what the National Restaurant Associations and that's what all these lobbying organizations that run Congress are interested in. But like, you can't just say that, because
Hmm.
John Taffer tried to just say that and he had to issue an apology later,
Yeah.
right? And so you have to find these other ways to say it. And this libertarian concern, which I agree, like theoretically, it could be like there are things like this Title 42 is concerning. I also am not. It makes me sick to my stomach to think about all the people that lost jobs because they were afraid of a vaccine that our media like couldn't message clearly about, and they might
Hmm.
have got misled or whatever. Like, but fundamentally, you have to look at this thing from the worker's perspective, which is like, well, that makes me sick. It makes me sicker that people are forced into a pandemic to go work in conditions that aren't safe, and frankly, both parties have incentives to downplay this, like the severity of this stuff.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, that's like I agree. Like I wish we did have room for the conversation, or like theoretically I like the conversation of like uh, let's like there's a lot of people that think we had that conversation and we never had it,
No, we
right? The one
didn't.
you're
Yeah.
talking about, right? We had this instead one where it's like, oh, what if we're forced to wear masks forever and the
Hmm.
government is coming around every 4 months and injecting us with Democrat voter serum, and like and we didn't have the one which is the fundamental one, which is like, uh where do the business owners want to take society and where are
Yeah.
they taking us?
And like it's just worth noting too, like to your point, Matt, like, you know, it's just like for me, like the reason I want to write this piece and I've been focusing on it is because again, people are always like, "Well, Abbott's not doing anything." It's like that's just not the case, right? So Abbott was, as you were saying, like what did the capitalist class want when the COVID-19 pandemic started? They want everybody to get back to work. Not all capitalists, but some of them were sort of happy with this kind of isolated situation. But a lot of them did want, especially their low wage workers, to be forced to come back and do the kind of necessary services that keep society running. Um, so what happens? Abbott gets incredible amount of campaign contributions from these guys, and then he uses the emergency powers that came with the disaster declaration to override city level mandates. Right. So he was the one who was bought, who ended up having the power to basically be able to override all other government authority. And I'd also argue, not to be starry eyed about local government, but local government is at least closer and arguably a little bit more reflective for most people than state government, at least here. Right. Because you have cities like Austin and Houston and Dallas, which are run by very different people than Abbott and his gang. So he finds a way to basically be able to override all of the small government in Texas, for the benefit of, these folks using COVID-19 disaster declaration as the way to go. But before we leave, we sort of skipped over the winter storm here. I think we have to play this clip one more time because, if you're not familiar with Abbott, he is not a very skilled orator. He's a great fundraiser. Um, He's good at coming up with ways to waste resources and put people's lives at risk, but speaking is not one of his strong suits. And this is a hot mic
We will
clip.
be dealing with here. There will be occasions.
This is a hot mic clip from the winter storm, which again killed between estimates are between like 400 and 900 people died, froze to death. After this, many Texans were faced with power bills, and if their power didn't go off, we're faced with power bills $16,000, $17,000, right? A huge crisis. I mean, talking to family and friends, you will just hear just devastating stories of the suffering that people are going through, and also some very beautiful and inspiring stories of people coming together, opening up their house to each other, and things like that. But anyways, here's Abbott at a state crisis, coming to speak to the state of Texas. And here's him practicing some very, very basic human emotion.
We will be dealing with here. There will be occasions when I'll be talking about like this, and some other occasions when I'll be talking like this.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Is that good enough?
It is Abbott. So there'll be more in the future. I mean, we'll definitely be watching this National Guard story because I think this is a huge scandal, and I think Abbott and his boys need to be hit on this a hell of a lot more than they are. It's absolutely devastating.